Um, okay, so welcome everyone to the TESS seminar. It's great to be back. I have my TESS t-shirt on, so thank you, Yoko, thank you, Bill, and all the team at TESS for inviting me and inviting Claudia to this seminar. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where we are, in Cairns, Townsville, Canberra, and wherever you are. Acknowledge the leaders, past, present, and emerging as well. Claudia is a Colombian scientist. She has a master's degree, which she earned from the University of Turin in Italy. And she has worked not only in academia and research, but also as part of advising governments throughout Latin America. And now her project spans 3 continents. So her current work and her PhD touches Colombian conservation strategies in national parks, South Africa, and also Australia. So welcome, Claudia. Aside from being an excellent researcher and a great person, she's a keen bird watcher and she loves to make chocolate. So hopefully we'll get to see that very soon as well. And just a shout out to Yoko. Thanks for organizing this. Thank you, Bill, and everybody involved in this, and hope that you enjoy this presentation. Off to you, Claudia.
All right, thank you, Nicolas, and thank you, Yoko, for this opportunity. And good afternoon, everyone in Townsville and on Zoom. I need to tell you in advance that it seems that the Canberra weather is taking a toll on me today, so I might be sniffing a little bit during the talk. Apologies for that. Apart from that, it's a pleasure to be here today and to share with you some of the results from the Conservation Futures project that we implemented in Colombia. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about what is futures thinking, what does it mean for biodiversity conservation, and to explain that, how it works, I will talk about our project implemented in Colombian protected areas. And then I want to finalize with some take-home messages and exploring the conditions that facilitate future-oriented conservation and some of the lessons learned in the process. So let's start to talk about futures thinking. So thinking about the future is not easy, but it's not rocket science either. It involves considering things that we expect or anticipate while being aware that some things are going to be unpredictable, and being aware also of potential disruptive issues that can change our current paradigms. One example of futures thinking that we might be familiar with is scenario planning, which are assumptions about the future that are usually based on data that represent the world as it is or as it has been, plus our expectations for the future. But when talking about futures thinking in the context of conservation, I also want for us to think about governance, or the processes by which people make decisions, which is a relevant but often neglected element of adaptation within conservation. Future-oriented conservation are approaches that anticipates and accepts future ecological change, while having a reflective approach around the implication of these changes for social, political, and ecological values. Having a future-oriented approach can help us to envision the outcomes of conservation strategy under different scenarios of change and prepare for that. So rather than planning for a single probable suite of known impact, planning processes can be able to accommodate different range of possible different futures. And in case you are wondering about this illustration, this illustration shows how people in the 60s imagined the future. In this case, is how homeschooling was going to facilitate parents' lives. And that was well before COVID times. And now what does a bridge have to do with conservation? I'm going to use this image to present metaphor for conservation strategies under change. This bridge is called the Choluteca Bridge in Honduras. This bridge was designed to withstand storms and hurricanes that are common in Central America. The same year this bridge was ready for use, Honduras was hit by Hurricane Mitch. There was a massive hurricane that caused massive damages in the region. Many bridges and roads were completely destroyed, but the Choluteca Bridge survived in almost perfect conditions. But as you see here, the roads on both sides of the bridge disappear. And the Choluteca River, which is about 100 meters wide, changed completely the course after the massive floods caused by the hurricane. And then the river no longer flowed under the bridge. And I think this is a powerful metaphor to reflect if current conservation strategies and policies are designed to endure the changing conditions and they are ready for future scenarios. So keep in mind this, that future thinking is more than predicting, is more about anticipating or envisioning different future scenarios, to be aware that surprises and black swans happen, that simplifying complexity and dealing with uncertainty starts with having the big picture and then zooming for details on it. And a constant questioning our assumptions, and remember that the problem can change. So with this, I'm going to move now to our implemented project in Colombia, conservation features in Colombia. This project was implemented between 2015 to 2018. And I was very fortunate to work alongside with a great team of people from the Australian National University, the Luke Hoffman Institute, CSIRO, Equilibrium Research in the UK, WWF Colombia, and National Parks in Colombia. Colombia was selected as the study case for this project, thanks mainly to the active role of WWF Colombia and their focus on climate smart conservation and the learning-oriented approach they use in their processes. We know that Colombia is, in case you don't know, Colombia is considered one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. But an important opportunity for us was the fact that Colombia has been actively working in understanding the hazards and impacts related to climate change. Parques Nacionales, that is the state agency in charge of national protected areas in Colombia, has been working in update its strategic planning and willing to include climate change and the transversal work that connect the different strategic lines. So for us, that was a fantastic opportunity to work on the science and policy interface. So for this project, we bring an interdisciplinary team, including researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, to have a conversation, reconsider conservation management to be less concerned about preserving particular ecological attributes and more about the values and benefits produced by protected areas and surrounding landscape, that protected areas are not isolated. We had several exploratory and working meetings where many questions were raised around what managers can do to address global change impacts and how to better understand what the main problem of the protected areas was. For example, they had many discussions about that climate change is related with more information. And that was something that we had to understand better before we were moving on in the project. Many other questions were also about what kind of assistance, reforms, or capabilities managers and policymakers and their advisors might need to address global change. And understanding all of that was useful for us to understand the context and then to move on co-designing the methodology. For us, we propose that that climate adaptation is less about those scientific and technical aspects of climate change, that's very relevant, but it's more about how we make good decisions for managing changing landscapes under climate transformation. Conceptually, the process builds from the values, rules, and knowledge framework. This framework explains that decision contexts are a social construction where held human values, for example, the motivation to conserve nature, alongside with the formal and informal rules and knowledge or the ways that people use to understand the world, all of these interact and influence the way we are making decisions. So using a co-production approach, I'm sorry, I'm going to move from this heavy diagrams in a moment. Using a co-production approach, we work in a new methodology that explore different actions for climate adaptation in protected areas management, and to understand how existing governance arrangement and the governance context is allowing or not making decisions. So the approach had 5 stages. The first one is aimed to identify what local communities and other stakeholders value about the protected area. That was useful to explore how climate change can impact and affect those values from the protected areas. Also, synthesis of knowledge about ecological responses to climate change in the areas. And also exploring previous projects and lessons learned about climate change. An important part was understanding the decision-making and knowledge governance context. For that, we made in-depth interviews with managers and practitioners to understand how the climate information was used. And a final stage called Future Dialogue. That's a workshop for exploring and reflecting on ecological transformation, values, and management options, bringing together all these previous stages and to understand what can we do now to prepare for uncertain futures. So the process was very useful to managers to think differently about the complex challenges of managing protected areas under climate change. I'm going to explain a little bit of how each stage was done. Of course, important to mention where. We tested this process in 2 pilot sites in Colombia. One was in the Amazon Piedmont in Alto Fragua National Park, and the other was the coffee growing region in the Central Andes. It's a national park called Otunquimbaya. Both pilot sites have completely different ecological, political, and geographical contexts. And that was very important. That's something very important to consider in the way the process was evolving and the methodology was implemented. So the knowledge synthesis. Understanding that effective strategies to respond to climate change need to be grounded in locally relevant information on the impacts of climate change. The climate knowledge synthesis included observed and anticipated impacts on species and ecosystems, landscapes, and ecological processes. For this, we use the climate change impacts Cascade. That's a process developed here in Australia by Michael Dunlop and Brown in 2008. We use information from Colombia, from Latin America, and global information, and reviewed the extent of climate-related ecological impacts that might affect Colombian landscapes, and to assess the potential magnitude of ecological change. while there are many uncertainties in the climate information, it is clear that climate change is affecting and can lead to major and significant ecological change and transforming ecosystems across Colombia. Some of the main identified impacts were related with changes in freshwater systems and sea level rise and droughts. Freshwater systems were a particular concern, especially because changes in rain patterns and temperature are affecting and will continue to affect hydrological conditions in the Andes, mainly related with glacial retreat and the variation of snowmelt contributions to freshwater systems. I don't know how much do you know about Colombia, but we have in Colombia and many countries in Latin America, in South America, we have snow-capped mountains, permanent snow-capped mountains. And at the moment, from the 17 snow or glacial mountains that we had in the previous century, at least 8 have already suffered a total melt. So those changes in the water and freshwater systems are going to affect and change recruitment and distribution of species and a range of impacts on water provision for cities and livelihoods. And those impacts are already being observed in different parts of the Andes. Now let's move to the benefits and values. So to explore what benefits the stakeholders identify from the protected areas, we adapted the Protected Area Benefit Assessment Tool, or PABAT, which is a participatory method for identifying and prioritizing ecosystem services in protected areas. An important clarification here is that we merge benefits, that means what you get, and values, that's what you like or what you want. And that was assuming that people value something because of the benefit it provides to them. So this tool was adapted to the Colombian context. We had to modify some of the questions considering the legal background and of the Colombian protected areas and what the stakeholders, which stakeholders in the protected areas were going to participate. The methodology works with stakeholders, including local and indigenous communities, local governments, local businesses, to identify with all of them what is more important for them in the protected area. And the protected area staff were participating also, so they were able to contribute with their own knowledge and to learn from the dialogue with the communities. In both pilot sites, water provision was identified as the most important benefit from protected areas, and in some degree also tourism. And that was important because very often protected areas are declared for protecting a species or an ecosystem, but in this case, we're more about the ecosystem services the protected areas provide to the community. So participants during the process, they share the knowledge on the area, the perception they have about potential impacts of climate change on those benefits. For example, some of them mentioned how the forest cover, how they perceive the forest cover in the watershed as an important buffer to reduce the impacts of climate change in the area. And that was their knowledge, it wasn't science informing them. The lessons learned process, we had some workshops in both sides to explore what is already known in each part about climate change. And it was useful to create a common narrative about climate change and the impacts, and ensuring that everyone was speaking the same language, while identifying what people have learned previously about climate change from implemented projects, from policies or planning activities. And they created a timeline of climate change related activities or policies or things in the area. So that allowed them also to start reflecting on the processes of change and start thinking about the barriers and opportunities they have been facing through time. The knowledge governance and arrangements, for this we conducted some interviews with protected area managers, with some NGOs and academic, different stakeholders to understand how they produce, use, and share knowledge in the protected area, and how that knowledge is informing planning and future action. So that was useful for us to explore the institutional incentives or barriers for sharing knowledge, what gaps in communication exist at the moment that might be preventing an effective use, and identify what actions can be more efficient, can lead to a more efficient decision making for management. So we were able to map the knowledge governance arrangements. This is a synthesis of who participate in sharing and producing knowledge in Colombian protected areas, from local at the bottom to regional and central level. And this was useful to identify who participates and what narratives are they using for making decisions and using information. Some of the things we found is that climate change can support the strategic planning. However, climate information is not always used in the planning processes, mainly because many barriers that still exist to knowledge management and knowledge integration across the scales. For instance, different regions have specific knowledge governance arrangements. In some cases, collaboration structures facilitate that knowledge integration across scales, but each region faces different challenges with respect to integrating climate information into planning. For example, here in this part, we have how the coffee growing region have fantastic collaboration schemes that are integrating knowledge from local communities, from private sector, from academia, NGOs, and how all of this is informing local level and regional, and even starting to change policies at national level. So other thing we were able to document was that scientific and technical information is the favorite form of knowledge to inform policy making in Colombia. But precisely climate change is allowing transition towards more inclusive knowledge systems and start integrating the local and indigenous knowledge, especially at local level. And this is starting to change the way these knowledge systems are used in Colombian protected areas. So that demonstrates that Parques Nacionales in Colombia is incorporating different epistemologies and ontologies to negotiate conservation agendas. The final stage is what we call the future dialogue. By now, when we arrive to this stage, participants should understand what are the potential climate change impacts in the areas, what the stakeholders consider are the most important benefits of an ecosystem services, what they have learned previously about climate change, and what different types of knowledge systems exist and are used to influence decision making. So this final stage brings together the stakeholders in a 2-day workshop that was useful to identify a set of adaptation options to identify 2 different likely future conditions and addressing the main concerns to implement those adaptation options. So here we have the results from the first day that was focused mainly on ecological transformation. In the upper part, we have the results from the Amazon, and in blue in the bottom from the coffee growing region. In the Amazon, people explore mainly benefits related with water, and in the coffee growing region about tourism. And in both areas, they use examples of ecological change from the climate change synthesis, focusing on recognizing the many potential types of change, that some changes can have long-term consequences, but also noting that a change does not necessarily mean loss in relation to the benefit provided by the protected area, because benefits for society usually are related with specific environmental characteristics or ecological features. But while they were approaching the value of protected areas through benefits, that allowed participants to rethink the problem and find solutions in a more positive way, instead of focusing on biophysical scenarios of change that usually highlight loss of the existing characteristics. So these transitions through different questions, these questions here, encourage participants to decouple the benefits from ecological features and to recognize whether a particular benefit might be maintained, even if the ecosystem change. For example, in the coffee growing region, one thing they were able to think about or reflect was tourism is dependent on ecological diversity, but the loss of some species is likely to be offset with new species arriving if the ecosystem transforms. And in the second day, that we worked more on the management and governance of the process, participants started to identify what barriers exist to implement climate adaptation, and they start considering where those barriers exist, who hold authority for those barriers, as well as identify what opportunities exist and how they can implement those opportunities. For example, they were able to think on whether the different values, rules, and knowledge might be contested. For instance, where different stakeholder groups may have different values, or whether the rules from one organization clash or contradict another. So this helped to focus attention on what knowledge to manage future transformations need, including the implications of uncertainty. So we were able to see through all these stages and in the workshop, we were able to see a change in the way participants perceive climate information for decision making. In yellow here, we have some examples, some quotes from the workshop, what the participants say during the workshop. And one important thing for us was that strong emphasis they had at the beginning for information, that they were like, we need information for climate change. But that completely changed after the process. And they were able to think beforehand what they might need in relation to monitoring biodiversity and conservation goals related with climate change. They also were able to understand or see ecological transformations in a different way, not just as negative issues in the future, but starting to appreciate and identify management options they have now, and especially based on the benefits of the protected area, and identifying what they can start moving and what barriers they can start working on that prevent them to work and change for an effective adaptation. Sorry. But changing the way we look at adaptation and changing the governance systems where adaptation happens is not always easy. That's important to say. So we identified 4 small transitions that can help in the process. The first one is updating the traditional protected area management philosophy of resisting ecological change towards practices that are more towards accepting, anticipating, and embracing change in situations, for example, in situations where change is inevitable, as the case of the melting glaciers in the Andes. The protected area will need to be managed in a different way. And it's better to start thinking about it now to start realizing what this means before that change happened. A second transition is that focus on preserving the values and benefits from protected areas is better rather than just conserving particular ecological attributes. That can help managers to focus on the overall ecological function of the protected area and the landscapes, and open up additional management options. Working with local stakeholders and local communities around the protected area can help to identify what is important to them in addition to the core protected area value, that's nature conservation, but start identifying what benefits and what ecosystem services are more relevant, and start building that local support for adaptation with those local communities. The third transition is recognizing that climate change adaptation is not just a matter of getting the right climate science, but it's also a matter of governance to manage protected areas through periods of rapid change. And recognizing this can offer opportunities to integrate diverse forms of knowledge, facilitating the integration of values and benefits beyond just working on ecological information. And the final transition is moving from a focus on immediate problem solving to more proactive learning practices that implement future thinking. Sorry. For this, understanding, anticipating, and embracing ecological transformation, that is not easy, but it's important to have that open dialogue, reflect on that, and envision the possible futures and possible alternatives to rearticulate current practices. In the case of Colombia, we were able, one of our conclusions at the point was that protected area managers were well advanced in this transition, in transition one, and halfway in this one, problem solving towards integrating more the ongoing learning approach. And they are still working on how to work in the other transitions, but that might require working on other barriers, political or institutional barriers. So one of our conclusions was that applying these values, rules, and knowledge framework was very useful for us to help setting the context at the beginning of the co-production process, and also to define the activities with the stakeholders. And later in the process, it helped the stakeholders to identify the connection between the values, rules, and knowledge dimensions, and how that relates with decision-making processes. We also learned that, first, this is a long-term process. Our implementation lasted like around 3 years. This is a long-term process that requires engagement and building trustful relationships to understand the problem, in one hand, for us, the researchers, but also for the stakeholders to understand the concepts, because those were foreign ideas for them. And context. Considering the context of the protected areas or the country is absolutely relevant. Even in the same country, in Colombia, working at different scales and levels of governance, people perceive things differently and have different arrangements and management approaches. And often this is heavily influenced by cultural, political, and particularly educational histories that affect how they understand climate change and how that affect their expectations for the future. So it's important to recognize that each protected area or country or region is going to be different, and it's going to continue to be different with time. For example, in my current research, where I am comparing Australia, South Africa, and Colombian protected areas approaches to climate adaptation, I will say that each country will have completely different results if we apply this methodology. And that's related with the different expectations people have for the future and the different political contexts in each one. Another important thing is that applying this in Colombia was made easier by the strong interest protected areas in Colombia has in understanding climate change and the long history of analysis and synthesis within all levels of management. So it is important to start where people are at the moment. For example, coming back to that long debates about we need more information, we need more climate science. But discussing that from the very beginning of the project was very useful to start understanding and build on what the managers already know and what they have done, because that experiential knowledge is absolutely relevant in the process. Also important to build and nurture that collective understanding and that process. Also, that's probably one of the most difficult parts, is recognizing that politics is always going to be present and is unavoidable. But it's better to acknowledge that those political problems are there, acknowledge that and manage that rather than ignore it. And then that comes the importance of being flexible and open during the processes. Because anyone that is working with climate change in context of protected area management or water resources management will have to look at constantly at a range of different ways of facts to constantly analyze the situation, make assumptions of what's going to happen, probably guess what's going to happen, and come to provisional conclusions. And that is something that is going to be reassessed and reanalyzed constantly as the situations are changing, are unfolding. So to summarize, a future-oriented approach examines the observed and expected climate change affecting protected areas, local livelihood systems, and the provision of ecosystem services for society. Future-oriented conservation calls for continuous changes in conservation planning and the values, norms, and rules that guide that conservation planning in response to accelerating global change. And future-oriented conservation is fundamentally a learning-based approach. It includes deliberative strategies to create the conditions in which individual and collective learning can occur. And that's all from my part. Thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward for questions or comments.